The world for 10-year-old Elara was a map of cracks. There were cracks in the faded linoleum of their small kitchen floor, a jagged geography of wear and tear. There were cracks in the porcelain of the teacups her grandmother cherished, delicate white veins that spoke of 100 accidental drops. Most of all, there were cracks in the ceiling above her bed, a sprawling, dusty delta that seemed to grow wider with every passing storm, whispering threats of collapse that lulled her into uneasy sleep. Her grandmother, Lena, used to say that every crack told a story. She would trace the lines on the teacups with a frail, arthritic finger and tell Elara about a wedding, a birthday, a clumsy but beloved husband long since passed. But lately, Lena's stories had faded. The illness had settled deep in her bones, a cold and quiet thief that stole her energy and her words, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any sound Elara had ever known. They lived on a street that time had forgotten, a row of weary clapboard houses with peeling paint and sagging porches. Hope was a currency in short supply here. It had been spent on lottery tickets, on hollow promises from politicians, on prayers that seemed to get lost in the smog-choked sky. Now, a new kind of despair was creeping in, a man in a crisp suit named Mr. Sterling. He wanted their land, their homes, their stories. He wanted to scrape it all clean and build something new and shiny that had no room for people like them. Mr. Sterling's method was a slow, deliberate strangulation. He bought one house, then another, letting them fall into ruin. He sent letters filled with legal jargon that felt like punches to the gut. Foreclosure notices, printed on blood-red paper, began appearing on doors like plagues. The bank, which had once seemed like a solid, dependable place, now felt like an accomplice, its voice on the phone cold and impersonal. The mortgage was 3 months behind. The final notice had been nailed to their front door just last week, its metal tack a single, merciless eye staring them down. Elara carried this weight in her small shoulders. It was a burden too heavy for a child, a constant, dull ache behind her eyes. She watched her grandmother sleep, her breath a shallow, rattling thing, and felt a fierce, desperate love that was tangled up with pure terror. The $20 bill tucked into the sugar bowl was the last of their money. It was meant for the refill of Lena's prescription, the one that eased the fire in her lungs. It was a flimsy shield against a rising tide of disaster. That afternoon, the heat was a physical presence, pressing down on the asphalt and making the air shimmer. Elara was sitting on the porch steps, trying to read a book from the school library, but the words kept swimming away from the page, replaced by the grim arithmetic of their debt. That was when she heard the sound. It was a cough, a sputter, then a final, wheezing groan of dying metal. A motorcycle, a monstrous thing of chrome and black leather, had coasted to a stop right in front of their house. The man on it was just as monstrous. He was huge, a mountain of a man clad in a dusty leather vest covered in patches that looked like cryptic warnings. His beard was a wild, tangled storm of gray and black, and a long, jagged scar cut a pale path from his temple to his jaw. He kicked at the engine with a heavy boot, cursing under his breath with a voice like gravel grinding together. Elara froze. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, a litany of warnings about strangers, about men who looked like that. They were trouble. They were danger. She should go inside, lock the door, and pretend she had seen nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The man let out a roar of frustration and slammed his fist against the gas tank. The sound echoed down the quiet, anxious street. He looked up then, and his eyes, buried beneath thick, dark brows, swept over the row of houses. They paused on her. Elara felt pinned by his gaze, small and fragile. He wasn't looking at her with malice, but with a kind of weary desperation that she recognized. It was the same look she saw in her own reflection sometimes. He wiped a grimy hand across his forehead, smearing sweat and dust, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was the slump that did it. It was a gesture of utter exhaustion, of a man at the end of his rope. And in that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just a person. A person who was broken down, hot, and utterly alone. Another voice, older and quieter than the fear, whispered in her mind. It was Lena's voice from a better time, from a day when they had shared their meager lunch with a hungry stray dog. "When you can help, you help," Lena had said, her voice warm and sure. "Doesn't matter who or what. Kindness is a seed. You never know what it'll grow into." Before she could second-guess herself, Elara slipped inside the house. She filled their cleanest glass with cool water from the tap, the condensation beating on its surface. Her hands trembled as she walked back outside, down the creaking wooden steps. She held the glass out to the giant. He stared at it, then at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he did nothing. Elara's courage began to waver. Maybe this was a mistake. A terrible, foolish mistake. But then, slowly, he reached out and took the glass from her. His hand was huge, calloused and scarred, and it completely engulfed hers for a second. He drained the water in 3 long gulps, his Adam's apple bobbing. He handed the empty glass back, his movements deliberate. "Thank you, kid," he grumbled, his voice still rough, but the sharpest edges had been worn away. "You're welcome," she whispered, clutching the glass to her chest. He turned back to the bike, his frustration returning. He muttered about a busted fuel line, about being miles from anywhere. He kicked at the tire again, a picture of impotent rage. Elara watched him, and she saw the numbers from the foreclosure notice superimposed over his angry form. She saw the empty pill bottle on her grandmother's nightstand. She saw the $20 bill in the sugar bowl. It was a crazy thought. It was illogical. It was everything she shouldn't do. That money was life. It was medicine. It was one more day of her grandmother breathing a little easier. Giving it away was like setting fire to their last lifeboat. But the image of his slumped shoulders wouldn't leave her. The echo of her grandmother's words rang in her ears. Kindness is a seed. She turned and ran back inside, her heart pounding a different rhythm now. It wasn't fear, it was a strange, reckless certainty. She reached into the sugar bowl, her fingers closing around the worn, folded bill. It felt warm in her hand, heavy with the weight of their survival. She ran back out onto the porch. "Sir," she called out, her voice small but clear. The biker turned, looking surprised to see her again. She walked right up to him, her gaze fixed on the intricate silver skull on his belt buckle because she was too afraid to meet his eyes. She held out the $20 bill. "Here," she said. "Maybe this will help. For a tow truck. Or a bus ticket." The man stared at the money in her hand. He looked from the bill to her face, then to the peeling paint on her house, the foreclosure notice still tacked to the door. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, confusion, suspicion, maybe something else entirely. "I can't take your money, kid," he said, his voice softer than she thought possible. "Please," she insisted, pushing it toward him. "My grandma says when you can help, you help. It's all I have, but you need it more right now." He hesitated for a long, silent moment. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of him, he reached out and gently took the bill from her fingers. He didn't look at it. He looked at her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elara." "Well, Elara," he said, folding the $20 bill with a strange reverence and tucking it into a small pocket on his vest. "My name's Stitch. And I'm in your debt." He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "A debt that will be paid." He turned and, with surprising ease, began pushing the massive motorcycle down the street. Elara watched him go until he was just a dark shape in the shimmering heat, and then he was gone. She stood on the porch, the empty glass in her hand, a hollow feeling in her stomach. She had just given away their last hope. She had planted a seed in barren ground, and she was terrified it would never grow. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing descent. The $20 was gone, and with it, any pretense of control. Lena's cough grew worse, a dry, rattling sound that filled the small house day and night. Elara tried to make her comfortable, spooning broth into her mouth and reading her stories, but she could see her grandmother fading, slipping away into the fog of her illness. The hope in Lena's eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary sadness. Mr. Sterling's pressure intensified. His men, two smirking figures in cheap suits, started showing up unannounced. They would stand on the sidewalk, pointing at the house, talking loudly about demolition and property values. They taped a new notice to the door, this one a bright, screaming yellow, announcing the final auction date. It was 2 days away. Elara felt foolish. The memory of the biker, of her grand gesture, now felt like a child's naive fantasy. Stitch. He was probably long gone, her $20 spent on a cheap meal and forgotten. A debt that will be paid. The words mocked her now, a bitter echo in the quiet, desperate house. Her act of kindness had been meaningless, a single drop of water in a raging fire. It had changed nothing. It had only made their situation worse. The neighborhood watched, a silent chorus of fear. They offered what they could, a casserole, a few dollars for the electric bill, but they were all drowning in the same slow tide. Mr. Henderson from next door, a man who had worked at the steel mill for 40 years, had already taken Sterling's lowball offer. His house now stood empty, its windows like vacant eyes. The street was dying, one family at a time. On the morning before the auction, Elara woke to a feeling of profound finality. This was their last day. Tomorrow, men would come and put their lives on the curb. Strangers would walk through their home, touching Lena's things, their stories reduced to inventory on a clipboard. She sat on the porch, watching the sun rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that felt like a cruel joke. The beauty of the world felt distant, something she could see but no longer touch. Then she heard it. At first, it was just a faint vibration, a hum so low it was more a feeling in the soles of her feet than a sound. She thought it might be a distant train or the rumble of a truck on the highway. But it didn't fade. It grew. Steadily, methodically, it swelled from a hum to a growl, a deep-throated thrum that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The windows of her house began to rattle softly. The last remaining teacup on the kitchen shelf vibrated against its saucer, a tiny, frantic dance. Mr. Henderson's dog, usually silent, began to bark, a high, panicked sound. The growl deepened, becoming a roar, a rolling wave of thunder that had nothing to do with the weather. It was mechanical. It was powerful. And it was getting closer. Elara stood up, her heart beginning to pound with a primal, nameless dread. She scanned the end of the street. Nothing. But the sound was immense now, a physical force that shook the very air she was breathing. It was the sound of an approaching army. And then she saw them. A single, brilliant point of light appeared at the far end of the block. It was followed by another, and then two more, forming a spearhead. Behind them, the street filled with light. It was a flood, a river of chrome and steel that poured into their forgotten neighborhood. Motorcycles. Not one, not 10, but dozens, then scores, then hundreds. They moved with a disciplined grace, a tidal wave of polished metal and black leather, filling the street from curb to curb. The roar was deafening, a solid wall of sound that blotted out everything else. Onlookers appeared at their windows, their faces pale with shock and fear. Doors were quickly locked. Curtains were pulled back by trembling hands. This wasn't a parade. This was an invasion. Sterling's two men, who had just arrived for their daily ritual of intimidation, stood frozen on the sidewalk, their smirks gone, replaced by slack-jawed terror. The procession was endless. Elara counted until she lost track, her mind unable to process the scale of it. It felt like every biker in the world had descended upon their tiny, broken street. They filled the road in front of her house, a disciplined legion that stretched back as far as she could see. 500 engines, roaring in unison. At the very front of the formation, a single bike coasted to a stop directly in front of her porch. The rider was a mountain. He wore a dusty leather vest covered in patches, and a long, jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw. He swung a heavy leg over his bike and planted his boots on the asphalt. It was Stitch. He raised a single, gloved hand. And in a staggering display of coordinated power, 500 engines cut out at the exact same moment. The world, which had been filled with a cataclysmic roar, was plunged into an absolute, ringing silence. The only sound was the frantic barking of the dog and the collective, held breath of an entire neighborhood. The silence was more intimidating than the noise had been. It was heavy, purposeful, and focused entirely on the small, terrified girl standing on the sagging porch. Stitch walked toward her, his heavy boots making no sound on the cracked pavement. He moved past Sterling's petrified men as if they were statues. He stopped at the bottom of her steps and looked up at her. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a worn, carefully folded $20 bill. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. "I told you," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the silent street. A debt would be paid. He looked from the money to the foreclosure notice on her door. A cold, hard anger settled in his eyes. "We are the Iron Redeemers," he announced, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "And we protect what protects us. This girl, this child, she showed more honor with $20 than this whole city has shown her family in a lifetime. She gave us her last dollar when we were stranded. So now, we are here to settle her accounts." From the Silent Legion, another biker stepped forward. He was older, with a neat gray beard, and he carried a leather briefcase. He walked up the steps and handed a thick envelope to Alara. "My name is Marcus," he said gently. "I'm the club's attorney. In here, you will find the deed to this house. It is now yours, free and clear. The mortgage has been paid in full." Alara stared at the envelope, her mind refusing to understand. "Paid? How?" Before she could speak, another man stepped forward, this one built like a brick wall and carrying a clipboard. He began walking around the porch, tapping the support beams, his eyes scanning the roofline. "I'm Gus," he grunted. "Lead contractor. The foundation's shot, the roof's a mess, and the wiring's a fire hazard. We'll have it all new by the end of the week." Suddenly, the silent army moved. It was a flurry of organized, purposeful action. Bikers, who moments before had looked like a terrifying mob, began unloading equipment from saddlebags and small trailers hitched to their bikes. Tool belts were buckled on. Saws, hammers, and drills appeared. They were carpenters, electricians, plumbers, roofers, an entire construction company on two wheels. They swarmed the house, their movements efficient and professional. Just then, a sleek black car screeched to a halt at the end of the street, blocked by the wall of motorcycles. Mr. Sterling got out, his face a mask of purple rage. He stormed toward the house, his expensive shoes crunching on the neglected asphalt. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his voice shrill. "This is private property. I'll have all of you arrested for trespassing." Stitch turned to face him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silent weight of 500 men stood behind him. "This property belongs to the family that lives here," Stitch said, his voice flat and cold as steel. "You, on the other hand, are the one who's trespassing. I have a legal claim." Sterling shrieked, waving a piece of paper. "The auction is tomorrow. This house is mine." Marcus, the lawyer, stepped forward again. He adjusted his glasses. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, it's not," he said calmly. "The debt has been satisfied. The lien has been lifted. Your claim is void." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Furthermore, while we were looking into this matter, we uncovered a rather disturbing pattern of predatory lending and harassment targeting the elderly and financially vulnerable residents of this community. We've taken the liberty of compiling our findings, along with sworn affidavits from a dozen of your former clients, and have submitted them to the State Attorney General's office. I believe you'll be hearing from them very, very soon." The color drained from Sterling's face. He looked from the lawyer's calm, confident expression to the unblinking stares of the hundreds of bikers surrounding him. He saw the faces of his victims, the neighbors who had been too scared to fight back, now watching him from their porches with newfound courage. His empire of fear had crumbled in a single morning. Without another word, he turned, stumbled back to his car, and sped away. The work on the house began in earnest. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the roar of engines. It was the sound of renewal, of restoration. A team of bikers gently helped Lena, wrapped in a warm blanket, to a comfortable chair on the lawn where she could watch, her eyes wide with disbelief and tears of gratitude streaming down her face. Another member, a woman with kind eyes and a paramedic patch on her vest, knelt beside her, checking her pulse and speaking to her in a soft, reassuring voice. She promised a full medical evaluation from a doctor who owed the club a favor. Elara stood on the porch, watching the whirlwind of activity. Men who looked like they could break the world in two were carefully replacing rotted wood, their movements precise and gentle. They were rebuilding her home. They were rebuilding her life. Stitch walked back over to her, the $20 bill still in his hand. He pressed it back into her palm. "You keep this," he said. "To remind you. A little bit of light can beat back a whole lot of darkness." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the scar and the beard and the intimidating size. She saw the heart of the man. It was a good heart. A strong heart. An honorable heart. "Why?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Why all of this?" "For me." Stitch knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Because you didn't see a monster, Elara," he said, his voice rough with a feeling she couldn't name. "You saw a man who needed help. You gave when you had nothing to give. That's a code our club lives by. Most of us, we've been left behind by the world at one time or another. We know what it's like. We protect our own. And that day, you became one of our own." Over the next week, the house was transformed. A new roof, solid and strong, replaced the old, leaky one. Fresh, sunny yellow paint covered the peeling gray. The windows were replaced, the plumbing fixed, the wiring made safe. The cracks in the ceiling above Elara's bed were gone, replaced by a smooth, clean surface. The Iron Redeemers worked from dawn until dusk, a tireless, dedicated force fueled by coffee and a profound sense of purpose. The entire neighborhood came alive around them. Neighbors brought food and water, their initial fear replaced by awe and gratitude. The street, once defined by its silence and despair, was now filled with the sounds of construction and quiet, respectful conversation. On the final day, the work was done. The house didn't just look new, it felt new. It felt safe. It felt like a home again, solid and secure. The bikers gathered their tools, their movements as disciplined as their arrival. They formed up on the street, their motorcycles gleaming in the afternoon sun. The whole neighborhood came out to see them off. They stood on their lawns and porches, no longer afraid. They were smiling. Some were crying. They applauded as the bikers mounted their machines. Stitch walked up to the new porch, where Elara and the healthier, brighter-eyed Lena stood. He gave Lena a respectful nod. Then he looked at Elara. He didn't say a word. He just placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. It was a gesture of profound respect. He turned, walked to his bike, and swung his leg over. He looked back at the street, at the faces of the people he and his club had saved from a predator. He looked at the little yellow house that now stood as a beacon of hope. Then he started his engine. One by one, 500 engines roared back to life, a triumphant, deafening chorus. But this time, the sound wasn't frightening. It was the sound of protection. It was the sound of honor. It was the sound of a debt, paid in full. With a final nod to Elara, Stitch led his army away. They rolled out of the neighborhood, a river of chrome and steel flowing back out into the world, leaving behind a legacy of kindness and a community reborn. Elara stood on her new porch, her grandmother's arm around her, and held the $20 bill tight in her hand. It was just a piece of paper, but it was proof. Proof that no act of compassion, no matter how small, is ever wasted. It was a seed she had planted in a moment of despair, and it had grown into a forest of hope that had saved them all.